Welcome to the VGM Kickstarter production course. Let's jump right in. So the bulk of this course is going to deal with mixing. Now, the harsh reality is that most composers are pretty good composers, meaning they can write a strong melody, they can write great harmonies, but what most composers struggle with is making their music sound good. And I hate to break it to you, but if you haven't recognized it yet, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work, a lot of practice to make your music sound good. And the reason is it usually boils down to mixing, which is essentially taking all of your ingredients, mixing them together. But it's not enough to just throw a compressor and a reverb and a delay and the EQ and all these terms, right? All of these music terms, all these plugins on your chain and call it done. No, there's a mastery to this. There's a very specific best case use scenario for each of these plugins. There's a certain order for these plugins. There's a time to use them. There's a time not to use them. And ultimately, it's this blend of artistry, musicality, but also science. So you can't really rely all the way on one or the other. So we're going to be mixing this artistry side and this technical side together throughout this course. And my goal is to at least show you the basics of how each of these processes work. That way you have the tools to make some of those decisions for yourself and to get to experiment, because half the battle is experimentation anyway. So here at the beginning, I want to show you the most basic level of mixing that will, believe it or not, get you 90% of the way there. If you can learn this one technique, which is the fastest technique too, if you can learn this one technique of volume mixing, you will get your music to be 90% of the way to finished. So let's focus on that here right at the beginning. In music, there are 3 layers to mixing. There's a foreground, a midground, and a background. Just like in a painting of a portrait, right? We have a person on a canvas. A great piece of art has a focal point. It is the part that our eyes see first, and usually it's the eyes of the painted person. That's the first thing that we see, and it's the most important because it kind of encapsulates the humanity of the person, right? So that is what we would call the foreground. That's the front. And then the midground is going to be that second layer. It's kind of there to support. So it might be the clothes of the person. It might be some of the objects in the room or the environment. And then that third layer is the background. We generally don't look at the background. It's just kind of there, but the background helps to create the atmosphere, create the environment. In the same way that this video, this composition that we're looking at right now, obviously as the speaker, you're supposed to look at me. You're supposed to look at my eyes. You're supposed to look at my mouth, whatever, my hand motions. This is the foreground. And then the next layer behind me might be, I don't know, the keyboards or the violin or whatever, the bookshelf behind me, that's the midground. And then the background is the wall. No one looks at the wall. It's not exciting, but it has to be there because it helps to create the environment that I'm in a room. I'm not outside, right? And as basic as that might seem, and as, as intuitive as that might feel, you would be shocked to learn how often composers ignore these rules, this rule of 3. And I'm telling you, this will get you 90% of the way there if you can just learn the basics of how to mix your music using volume to hit these 3 layers. So let's take a look at a real example of a recent track that I wrote for Aethermancer, which is an upcoming video game soundtrack. And this track is called Forbidden Fortress Deity Combat. So it's a big boss battle. And I want to show you in a very practical level how you might be able to do this as well and why mixing matters so much. Now, of course, from a composition angle, you should be focusing on the foreground always, meaning it's the instrument or the instrument group that is the most important, that if you were to just solo that one thing, the track should make sense. Maybe think of it like a pop song. You need the vocals, otherwise the song makes no sense. It's the most important part. So naturally, you would mix to make sure that the vocals are at the foreground of the mix. So here in this track, let's just play a small bit of it. So what we can tell already from this main section here, we have a very clear melody. Right here we have the nyckelharpa, which is a really cool string ethnic instrument. Sounds like this. And essentially, if you only had that melody, and it is actually doubled eventually with this wooden flute right here. But essentially, if you were to take that out completely, now we don't have a foreground anymore. We only have the supporting content, the midground and the background. And so a good mix really focuses on separating the foreground, the midground, and the background. So if that melody is the foreground, then the midground is going to be the next section, typically the harmony. So the harmony here is anything that helps to create the chord. And this is why in our previous course, the Kickstarter composition course, we focus so much on this whole separation of writing a great melody, writing great harmony, and how they are two distinctly different things, but when you combine them together in that holistic way, it now creates a very interesting piece of music. So here in the midground, the harmonic support, we have the pipe organ just blasting away on these low notes. We also have this dark synth pad. It's essentially a drone. We also have these brass blasts and really low contrabass clarinet, cool instrument. Just kind of creates this pulse in the background. And then our third and final layer is the background. The background matters because it creates the place, the setting, but by itself, it's usually not very interesting. And usually it is, if you have a drum beat, if you have any kind of percussion or any kind of supplemental material there in the background that really you could take it out and the track would be just fine. In this case, it's some percussion. So here's the track with zero background. Is it amazing how much energy just got sucked out of it? It doesn't really work anymore, but then you put it all back together. And now it works. So what does this mean from a mixing perspective, right? Because if all of those had equal volume levels, well, then it would just kind of be a mess. It would not sound great. So let's move over to the mixer window. So over here, I'm in Cubase, and it just has a very beautiful mixer window, and every DAW has a mixing window like this. And what I want to focus on right now are the volume sliders. So each of these faders here, these sliders, they represent volume. And in our next lesson, we will actually go through a full channel strip breakdown of what every single one of these buttons means. But for right now, the big slider represents volume. And it's measured in decibels, dB. That's what it stands for, decibels. And 0 is what is considered unity. 0.0 dB. That just means that is 100%. So typically, you don't want to go above 100% because then you will start losing what is called headroom. But what we're looking at right now is you want to make sure that each of those layers, the foreground, the midground, and the background, are each layered in such a way that the volumes represent that hierarchy. So for example, right here, if I were to solo my percussion track only, I can move my volume slider up and down. Just like that. And let's try playing it with the other instruments, and let's see what happens if this background is fighting and trying to become the midground or the foreground. What's it going to sound like? See how obnoxious it becomes? This should not be that loud. So we have to find that sweet spot where it feels like it is the background as it's supposed to be. It should feel present, but not so present that it gets in the way of the other instruments. Now, I don't think most composers necessarily struggle with the background instruments accidentally becoming the foreground. I actually think they have more trouble with the midground than anything, because the midground is supportive harmonic material, but what tends to happen is composers take the midground and they make it way too loud, and now we're hearing way more of that than the foreground material. So as long as you stay in this order, foreground, it should be the highest, midground should be somewhere in the middle, and that final supporting content, the background, should be way lower, you're going to be fine. You're going to have a very strong mix. And like I said, 90%. You'll be 90% of the way there. So let's do a quick little test of what that might sound like over here if we were to play with the volume sliders, the volume of the melody. What if the melody is buried? What if we are not, we don't have the volume loud enough on those? What is it going to sound like? Let's put it all back together, same spot. You hear how it just gets totally buried? You can't hear the lead line anymore, right? But I don't think that's necessarily what composers struggle with the most. As we talked about, I think it's really the midground that gets people the most in trouble. So let's go to some of the midground instruments, such as the pipe organ. What if that midground is fighting for attention and wants to be in first place and wants to be in the foreground? What is that going to sound like? Once again, it's obnoxious, right? So as you can see, this is an extremely simple concept, but I am shocked by how few composers get this. It is so common that the foreground and the midground are fighting for attention. There's so much going on, and they're competing for attention that the music just becomes a mess. But I guarantee you that if you can focus on keeping this hierarchy in order, foreground first, midground second, and the background last, as far as the volume faders go, your music is going to stand out. It's going to be fantastic. Your assignment for week 1, I'd like you to open an old track in your DAW and remix the volume levels to better focus on the foreground, midground, and background. I don't care what you choose for your music. Probably you should choose something that has as few layers as possible, just so that you can understand the concepts. But hey, if you really want to stretch yourselves and try something a little bit more complicated, you're more than welcome to as well. The main concept here is to make sure that you're hitting that hierarchy of those 3 different volume levels. I look forward to hearing what you share. And in our next video, we're going to be learning how to walk through the channel strip within your DAW.